What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? Frost cracked under her boots like an old promise. The smell of hay was damp and honest, the kind of smell that held winter and feed and steady warmth. Wind threaded itself through the empty stable, lifting a loose shingles song and scattering dust motes like slow, resigned confetti. It was January, brittle and pale, the kind of morning that makes you hold your breath against the cold even when you aren't trying to. The sky held the unkind clarity of a photograph. She moved like she had nowhere to go. Not because she believed it, but because leaving felt like breaking the last careful thing they had both tended. Her hands kept their own weather, stiff in thin air, quick to tremble. She did not speak about him. She spoke around him, folding a blanket, straightening a saddle, aligning a single brush with surgical care. Those small, deliberate motions were where words had gone to hide. When visitors asked, she laughed a little too late and made coffee that tasted like apology. The horse was not supposed to be the first thing she noticed. But then a chest, the color of old cream, turned inside the stall, and a head lifted with that impossible ancient understanding animals have for human hurt. The pinto gelding moved as if he remembered the shape of the house before the house remembered its doors. There was a white blaze that split his face and a scar along his foreleg, pale against the black of his stocking, like a comma left where a sentence might have continued. His ears flicked like small flags. He exhaled mist into the air. The breath hung between them, and she felt inexplicably seen. She had come that day with a list: repairs, feed, the small ledger in which she pretended to count out a future. The list had been folded until it knew her hands. She unfolded it now like a map that led nowhere. He watched her put on gloves and reach for the halter. Horses do not perform for grief. They are honest with boundaries. He was close enough to touch, not quite close enough to belong. When she stepped into the stall, he sniffed first at her sleeve, slow and thorough, the way someone might read a letter they were afraid they'd missed. The gesture was ordinary. It was how horses learn what you carried in your days: scent, salt, the lingering bits of other bodies. He took her into his mouth the way a child hears a secret, gentle and almost reverent, then let go. His lips brushed her hand with the dry, warm curiosity of an animal that had lived through seasons and men and things worse than silence. He leaned his head on the top rail and held her there like a question that would not be answered yet. She did not know his name. She had been to the farm only twice before, once to move out things he would never need again, once to collect the photographs that never fit back into an envelope. Names were fragile, tied to people and voices that belonged to other rooms. He had been left quietly, a practical arrangement after the accident, papers signed with signatures that make things official and unloving. The woman who managed the place called him Pinto, like a description where a name should be. As she looped the halter over his head, his skin was warm. Horses are muscle and memory. You could feel both when you pressed into his shoulder. He stood with the slow, steady patience of an animal that had been asked to wait, and had decided waiting was a trade-off for company. At first the bond was nothing cinematic. It started as two inexact gestures, her voice low, a soft cluck she hadn't used since before the hospital rooms, and him turning his body toward the sound. Real connection often begins as something nearly invisible, a shared rhythm, a breath matched, a silence that stops being lonely. She fed him a carrot. His teeth found it with unexpected delicacy, and she laughed at herself. He chewed, and she watched the way his jaw moved, muscles sliding under skin that had known cold and friction and harness. When she brushed him, tangles of his mane loosened like a memory uncoiling. Her hand kept steady pressure, her forearm remembering how to soothe. He stood still, eyes half-lidded, trusting the rhythm of someone who had not used this particular gentle motion in months. Their conversation happened in small adjustments. The angle of her hand, the tilt of his head, the soft sigh he made when she stopped and leaned her forehead to the warm curve of his neck. It was as intimate as any prayer she'd attempted, unstructured, messy, and something like surrender. He started at a distant truck. She flinched as old wounds did. The gelding's ears pinned for a moment, body tensing, weight shifting, hindquarters ready to pivot. Then he exhaled and returned his attention like a patient child who would not lecture her for being afraid. At lunchtime, she sat on the tack room step with a tin mug and watched him nap in the weak winter sun. Light pooled across his back in stripes. Those patched coats of brown and white made him look like someone patched together out of old maps. The sight filled her with an ache she didn't have words for. It was the ache that arrives when you realize a rhythm you once belonged to is gone. She said his name then, almost by accident. "Pinto," she said, and the word landed like a pebble into deep water. He lifted his head. For a moment the world was only the two of them, and the thin blue of the sky. He blinked slowly, and something in the way he looked at her felt like permission. Permission to keep existing in a life that had shifted without asking. The first night she slept poorly in the spare room above the barn. She woke to the sound of hooves in the yard and the small panic of a sky beginning to shift. When she went down, the gelding was at the stall door, breath fogging in the cold air, ears pricked toward a darkness that hummed with something she could not name. She tightened her coat and stepped toward him. He pushed his nose into her sleeve like a compass finding north. She felt the small, steady heat of him against her wrist and thought that if she could hold this place between them, the rest might not collapse so quickly. When she turned to leave, he followed. She did not understand why. She only felt the small, surprising weight of being pursued by something that needed her, as much as she might need it. The barn light swung, caught dust in its arc, and for the first time in months she let a breath out that blurred the edges of her grief. But somewhere under that release was a question. Why him? And what would it cost her to answer? Weeks braided into each other like frost on a fence. She learned the sound of him before dawn. Soft feet, a little snort, the slow exhale of a body that had grown used to being needed. The farm reorganized itself around that sound. Feeding, buckets, stalls swept with the same mechanical care grief had taught her. Time did not fix. It made small stitches, invisible unless you looked closely. On hard evenings she sat on the fence and spoke in fragments, half sentences, names she could not quite say aloud, a grocery list that kept her hands occupied. He listened the way horses listen, with the blunt, honest attention of an animal that never lied about wanting something. He would shift his weight, lower his head, breathe into the space she could not yet fill with words. Strange things started to show up like weather. The gelding would hesitate at a certain corner of the paddock, ears tilted toward a place that seemed empty. Once, while she cleaned the tack room, he froze and stamped, hair along his crest rising in a ripple. He nudged a loose board until it gave, and beneath it, they found a tin box of photographs and a small carved horse. Tokens that made her breath skip. The money and paperwork had been cleaved clean after the accident. Practical people had signed things in rooms with good light. He had been left in a quiet, pragmatic way, catalogued as Pinto in an inventory list. She had been told. She had not wanted to be told again. Yet here were pieces pulled up by the animal's persistent nose, as if he were excavating memory itself. One afternoon she found a folded letter tucked in the trunk under a saddle pad. His handwriting, small and crooked, opened like a window she had kept shuttered. He wrote of a storm he feared, and of the horse he had rescued from the roadside. "He will know what to do," the line read, casual and catastrophic at once. Her knees gave out on the tack room floor and the paper slipped from her hands. Horses are not seers. They are bodies that keep scent and rhythm. But he stood with his head on her shoulder, breathing slow and sure, while she let the letter name what her heart had not been able to accept. It was not prophecy so much as a trust she had not known she could inherit. A week later, the sky tightened. The weather rolled like a drum and the light shrank to a thin, hard strip. She was shutting the barn when wind hit, a shove that bent the big doors inward. The gelding paced, nostrils flaring. He was not frantic. He was focused. The radio fizzed and died. Something in the air sounded like a held breath. They moved toward the lane. He found corridors in the wind, pathways where the gale spent itself. The tornado arrived suddenly, a presence that rearranged everything it touched. Shingles flew. A tractor cartwheeled. Horses in the next field screamed. At the lane edge, half buried by a broken fence, a child clung to a post. Mud streaked the face and the child's small chest heaved with sobs. The tornado hunched between them and the world narrowed to that fragile figure. The gelding did what he had perhaps been bred and taught, and, in small ways rescued for, he placed his body between the storm and the child. He turned his broad chest so that the wind took him first. He lowered his head and gently pushed the child toward her, as if guiding with the same subtle pressure he used when asking a horse to move a step. The child wrapped arms around his neck, burying a face in his mane. She could feel the child's heartbeat, small and frantic, against her palm. It was not a deliberate sermon of heroism. It was muscle memory and temperament layered with the animal's old habit of reading weather and people. Animals carry what humans sometimes forget, the quiet map of paths to safety. He stood there, a warm, breathing shield, until the tornado moved on. When the sky cleared, the town's language bent toward wonder. Neighbors brought blankets and apples. Reporters called him a guardian. Parents said the child's name the way people say a prayer, and then add the geldings as a thanks. She found herself reluctant to accept praise. Gratitude was complicated when tied to a man who had left in a hurry, but the letter had been true. Some promises travel in the bodies of other beings. In the days after, the gelding's oddities made more sense. He led her to places where small relics hid: a photograph tucked in a hay bale, a ticket stub under the fence board, a carved wooden horse under the loose plank. Each item filled a space that grief had left open. The discoveries did not erase the past, but they threaded it back together in manageable pieces. Weeks turned into months. The child and her family mended what the storm had taken and visited the barn with bread and thanks. He accepted the offerings without ceremony, as if he had done only what the weather required. She, watching him graze in summer light, felt the line across his leg, the pale scar become simply part of his map, not a wound to be touched. Her life found new, ordinary rhythms. She laughed, small and cautious, at jokes that used to land differently. She slept with fewer starts. The morning rituals stitched themselves to the work of living. The letter stayed in a small box on the mantel, not a shrine but a ledger, proof that someone had intended care when they could no longer provide it. Months later, she would stand in a field that smelled of cut grass and remember the way the world had tilted that night. The child's hand fit in hers during a visit, stubborn and warm, and she saw how ordinary bravery had settled into small routines. The child returning to school, neighbors repairing roofs, her own hands learning to plant again. The gelding grazed nearby like a quiet monument. People asked what she had given him in return. She thought about it and answered simply, care, the kind that keeps a life whole in small, steady increments. Return daily. More stories will meet you here soon. Always. If this story touched you, subscribe, leave a comment, follow, and press the bell icon to watch daily videos and enjoy.